Okay, guys, welcome to John chapter 2. We're going to get into this. As it goes, we're going to pick up more. I'm actually having a problem seeing right now. My eyes are very irritated. Probably because the last couple of days I've been up really late, so that's my fault. I'm sitting up talking to my army buddies. But we're still going to, it's not going to stop us from doing what we said we were going to do, and we're going to do it. So we're going to get into John 2. If I stumble over some words, you know why. I'm struggling to see a little bit. So, this is going to be the chapter talking about the water turned to wine is at the wedding, and one of the first miracles recorded that Jesus has done. Now, that's not to say he hasn't done any more. John says in one point, and we'll get to that, if all the things he had done were written down, the world couldn't hold all the books. That's a lot of stuff. So the Bible only records a very small fraction of what's been done. So let us get into this. Let's see what else we can find. And again, we're in familiar territory, but it's always a good practice in the Bible to go back over it because you never know what else you might discover that you looked right past the last time. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." She knew who he was. And it was funny about it because in several cases, she shows a great lack of faith sometimes. And even Mary needed to be saved. So, verse 6, now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, he did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. The master of the feast called the bridegroom. And he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So the whole purpose was that you bring out the real good wines, everybody drinks the good wine, and they're happy, and when they get drunk, they're not going to worry about the bad wine. And so then they'll drink the bad wine, and they won't have any complaint. That way you make the good wine last longer, because they had no refrigeration, they couldn't keep that stuff very well at that time. So good wine went bad over time, it would turn to vinegar. Let's see, verse 12. After this, he went down to Capernaum. He, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. That's not what the temple was for, but that's what they were using it for. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." John records, or other recordings say, make it a den of thieves. Verse 17, then his disciples remember that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." So now they're starting to recall scripture that talks about these things. See, I believe, because, people didn't remember a lot of stuff back then, but then they did. Some people didn't read. Some people had problem getting access to the information. But at that time, and this has been ongoing for quite a while now, the Jews would read in the synagogue passages from the Bible and talk about them. And at that time, it's pretty easy to infer that they were in the book of Isaiah because they were quoting Isaiah right here. And in many other places they were quoting Isaiah. So it's not hard to come to a conclusion that they had this fresh in their memory. And then the Lord was recalling it too. So that whatever they saw, they would remember, wait a minute, there's scripture about this. It was proving who he was, because nobody else was doing these things. Verse 18, so the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show us, since you do these things?" So they're wondering, because they see things that are triggering these memories, and they're like, is this the one? But they wanted to prove it because they thought he was going to come in a different way. See, even they didn't understand their scriptures fully. Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then the Jews said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them. And they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. So you can see by how the chapter 2 is written, it was written after these things happened. Because he's referring back and forth to the end, to the beginning. But Jesus did not commit himself to them because he knew all men, and had no need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. So this chapter is a little thinner in its content, but it's making points. And these are points that are going to be rediscovered as we go through the rest of the book. What John's trying to do is John's trying to establish a frame of mind as we go through the scriptures. Because we're going to run into this stuff, and we're going to rediscover this stuff as we go, and different details of it. More descriptive. But he's trying to get us in the frame of mind as we read what's going on here and what the purpose of it is, and showing people knew who he was, but he knew who everybody was. And so it wasn't part of the purpose for him to have to drag everybody in and get them all set up, because in him doing what he did, not only did it arrange for him to pay the debt for sin, which is what was supposed to happen and what the scriptures talked about, but it also excluded those who had no intention of ever accepting him. And it forced them to have to admit, okay, this is the guy. We just don't want the guy. It forced them to have to expose themselves for who they really are and what they really thought. That they knew who he was, and they just didn't want him because they had this idea, and they were telling everybody, this is how the Messiah is going to come. But that wasn't according to Scripture. They were kind of changing a little bit. And they were misinterpreting certain verses and certain scriptures that were telling of the second coming, adding that to this time frame. But that's not it. He had to come first in this form, and then the second coming. So they had kind of twisted it, some of it on purpose, some of it because they didn't understand. Because they had had an exile, they had misunderstanding there. And a lot of people had changed stuff. They were in the Talmud at that time. So they were taking a lot of this stuff very much out of its context from Scriptures itself. And a lot of their scrolls in that had actually been rewritten. And they still talk about that today. So what John's trying to do is John's trying to get everybody in the right frame of mind as to what's going to take place after this. And that's what this chapter is attempting to do. And I think that's good, because at the beginning of the story, you need to be in the right frame of mind and have the setup for it, which is what he's doing. And then you dip into everything else. Now, tomorrow will be chapter 3, the new birth. And now he's really going to start getting into the information, because John, I think, has the longer account. But he generalizes the information of some of these first events, whereas the other writings really go into detail about them. But he goes into really good detail about other stuff, because that's where the key stuff is. That's where key details are. That's where the more important information. This is what I love about John and how he writes. And we'll see that as we go. All right, guys, that was John 2. Thank you all for watching. I will see you in the next one.